And now, the Deeper Thinking podcast, where philosophy, psychology, and power collide.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode explores something many of us sense but struggle to articulate: the disappearance of visible governance and the feeling that decisions shaping our lives happen elsewhere, beyond our reach, beyond our sight. We vote, we participate, we move through the structures of democracy, yet governance no longer presents itself as something to be seen or contested. Instead, we experience the quiet pull of invisible forces, the subtle nudges of algorithms, the quiet recalibrations of automated decisions, the policies that never arrive as debates but only as outcomes. We are not commanded, we are guided. We are not forced, we are steered. This shift leaves a vacuum, an unease that grows not from direct oppression but from the absence of something to push against. If governance no longer stands before us, then where do we look? If decisions emerge, but their origins are unclear, then what does power even mean? In response, we see a growing hunger for simplicity and certainty, a demand for politics that feels decisive, direct, real. Grand gestures, absolute choices, clear divisions between right and wrong, action and inaction. This is the rise of spectacle, the performance of power in an age where governance no longer insists on being visible. But is this clarity real? Or is it merely filling the space left behind by something deeper, something more complex, something that no longer asks to be seen? Let's go deeper. There was a time when to locate governance was to point to an institution, a leader, a document bearing the weight of authority. Even when power was contested, even when it was concealed behind bureaucracy or veiled in influence, it could still be named. To understand governance was to understand its structure, the mechanisms through which it operated, the individuals and institutions that enacted it. That certainty has faded, not because governance has vanished, but because it no longer demands to be recognized. There is no singular moment when this shift occurred, no clear line separating one era from the next. Instead, the nature of decision-making has changed in ways that feel almost imperceptible. Slow enough to be unnoticed, seamless enough to feel inevitable. What once required deliberation now unfolds through automated processes. What once needed approval is now embedded in the framework of everyday life. We still participate, still move within the rituals of governance, but the relationship has altered. Policy is enacted, but not necessarily debated. A decision is made, but the mechanism behind it is no longer clear. There is no singular authority to appeal to, because governance has become something more diffused, less a structure, more an environment. Influence does not move through formal decree, but through networks, through infrastructures that shape what is possible before we are even aware of the choice. Power is still present, but where does it reside? The traditional markers remain: government buildings, legislative bodies, judicial rulings, but they no longer capture the full picture. The platforms that mediate information, the algorithms that structure behavior, the automated systems that determine access, these too make decisions, and yet they do not govern in the way we once understood governance to function. They do not announce their role, do not require acknowledgement. They simply operate, and in doing so, they create the conditions under which governance occurs. To live within this system is not necessarily to be controlled in the way past generations might have imagined. It is not that rules are imposed more forcefully, nor that laws are applied with greater severity. Rather, it is that decisions are increasingly made before they reach the point of visibility. Preempted rather than debated, assumed rather than declared. The effect is subtle, a shift not in authority itself, but in how it manifests, in how it is recognized, in whether it even needs recognition at all. Governance has not disappeared, it has not been overthrown, nor has it been hidden from sight. But if its presence no longer requires acknowledgement, then what precisely remains of the act of governing? And if power still moves, but without the need for those it governs to see it, then do we still understand what it means to be governed? There was a time when the mechanisms of governance were assumed to be distinct from the structures of daily life. Politics belonged to its own domain, separate from commerce, separate from communication, separate from the private choices of individuals. The state was something apart, an entity that could be engaged with or ignored, challenged or obeyed. It had its own procedures, its own pace, its own limits. To be governed was to interact with this system at particular moments, in elections, in courts, in the drafting of laws. But today, governance no longer exists as something separate. It does not arrive at intervals, nor does it require a deliberate act of engagement. It has become embedded, absorbed into the fabric of interactions that shape the world in ways that feel less like rule and more like inevitability. It does not always appear in the form of explicit laws or state directives, nor does it necessarily require the apparatus of government to function. Instead, it moves through infrastructure, through invisible architectures of decision-making that do not dictate what we must do, but instead shape what is available for us to choose. A highway is built and the way people move is determined for generations. A content moderation policy is adjusted, and entire forms of speech disappear from view. A lending algorithm is modified, and entire communities find their economic possibilities narrowed. These are decisions, but they are not always recognized as such. They do not appear in manifestos or public debates. They do not arrive as edicts or declarations. Yet they are governance, determining not just how society functions, but what society comes to expect as normal, as possible, as beyond question. This is not the governance of rulers and laws, but of systems and flows. It does not impose itself as an external force because it does not need to. It shapes behavior not through prohibition, but through design. It does not tell us what we must do, only what is available to us. It does not tell us what is forbidden, only what we are unlikely to encounter. And because its decisions are built into the mechanisms through which the world operates, it rarely needs to justify itself. If this is governance, then where is the space for dissent? Not in the traditional sense. Protests can still be held, arguments still made, alternatives still imagined, but in the sense of structural opposition. If power no longer relies on enforcement, if it no longer stands outside the flow of daily life, then where does one stand in order to challenge it? Or has governance reached a point where it no longer requires opposition because it no longer recognizes itself as something that must be defended? There was a time when governance was something to be challenged. Power, once named, could be resisted. A law could be overturned, a leader unseated, an institution reformed or abolished. To question authority was to engage in a visible struggle, one where the stakes were clear, where opposition could be measured in votes cast, in protests held, in arguments won or lost. Even where power was entrenched, even where it resisted change, it still had a location. To resist it was to demand recognition, to insist upon an alternative. But what does opposition look like when governance is no longer something apart, when it does not impose itself as a rule to be broken, a force to be countered? The act of dissent assumes a structure against which it is directed. It assumes there is something to refuse, something to reject. But when governance moves not through dictates, but through the shaping of possibility itself, when it no longer needs to prohibit, but merely to direct, what does it mean to oppose? If a law is unjust, it can be repealed. If a policy is flawed, it can be revised. But what is the process for challenging the decision that is never announced, the rule that is never written, the outcome that is not imposed, but simply made to seem inevitable? What does it mean to resist when resistance itself has no clear object, when power functions not as an order, but as a condition? To speak of governance in these terms is not to claim that control has vanished. The ability to determine outcomes still exists. Some decisions still bear the mark of political authority. But the domain in which opposition operates has become narrower, more diffuse. A company alters an algorithm, and the public conversation shifts without debate. A private platform enforces new rules, and entire communities of discourse disappear without protest. A financial institution automates risk calculations, and access to capital is transformed, not by law, but by design. These are political acts, but they do not announce themselves as such. They are moments of governance that leave no space for the kind of dissent that assumes power must justify itself. Perhaps governance no longer needs to be defended because it no longer presents itself as something to be questioned. Perhaps it does not require enforcement because it no longer appears as force. If there is no law to repeal, no authority to depose, then what does opposition look like? If the systems that shape our choices do not impose, but simply structure the world in which those choices are made, then does the very concept of resistance still hold meaning? Or has governance found a way to move beyond the need for resistance altogether? There was a time when governance needed legitimacy. Power, even when imposed, had to justify itself. Kings ruled by divine right, governments by the will of the people, institutions by law and precedent. Whether by consent or coercion, authority required recognition. It needed to be seen, acknowledged, accepted, or contested. A ruler could not govern in secret, nor could a government persist indefinitely without the appearance of legitimacy. Power relied on belief, on rituals of affirmation, on the assumption that those who were ruled understood, at least in theory, why they were governed. But what happens when governance no longer requires legitimacy? When it no longer seeks validation, no longer depends on belief? What happens when authority continues not because it is justified, but simply because it is embedded? A law once enacted can be repealed, a government once elected can be removed, but an infrastructure once established does not ask for consent. It does not seek legitimacy. It does not require approval. A road is built and movement follows. A digital platform reorganizes its architecture and communication shifts accordingly. A financial system automates its decisions and access to credit is reshaped without deliberation. These are acts of governance, but they do not require belief in the system that produces them. They do not ask to be defended because they do not announce themselves as political. They do not even require those who exist within them to acknowledge that they are being governed at all. To recognize this shift is not to claim that governance has ceased to function. Decisions are still made, policies still take effect, consequences still follow. But something fundamental has changed in the relationship between authority and those it governs. If legitimacy was once the foundation of governance, if power needed recognition in order to sustain itself, then what does it mean when governance no longer depends on recognition at all? In the past, those who questioned authority demanded justification. They insisted on transparency, on accountability, on the right to understand how power was exercised. But what if the very premise of justification has become obsolete? What if governance no longer needs to explain itself? What if it does not even consider itself an authority to be questioned? Perhaps governance no longer seeks legitimacy because it no longer requires belief. Perhaps it does not need approval because it no longer asks to be understood. If authority now functions not as something external, but as part of the landscape, not as a decision imposed, but as an environment navigated, then what remains of the idea that those who govern must answer to those who are governed? Or has governance reached a point where legitimacy itself is no longer a meaningful concept? There was a time when governance was expected to account for itself. Power, whether absolute or constrained, was meant to be answerable. A government explained its policies, a ruler justified decisions, an institution defended its purpose. Even when authority resisted scrutiny, even when it concealed its workings, there was still an expectation that it could, if pressed, be made to respond. To govern was not only to rule, but to acknowledge that rule required some form of communication, some engagement with those who were governed. But governance today does not always behave as something that must be explained. It still operates, still produces outcomes, still structures society, but it does not always present itself as something that must be debated or defended. Instead, it moves quietly, without the expectation that it will be questioned at all. A new policy is not announced, but embedded within an updated system. A financial decision is not imposed, but written into the logic of a machine learning model. A shift in governance does not take place in a legislature or a court, but in the back-end adjustments of a platform that's become integral to daily life. These decisions are made. They shape reality, but they do not arrive in the form of decrees. They do not call for discussion, nor do they appear as points of controversy. They do not demand approval because they do not present themselves as things to be approved. To challenge authority once meant forcing it to respond, to demand an answer, an explanation, a justification. But how does one question something that does not position itself as an authority in the first place? How does one challenge a structure that does not insist upon its own necessity, but instead operates as if it is merely part of the landscape? A government may be held to account, but what of an automated process that determines risk without revealing its criteria? A law can be repealed, but what of an infrastructure that organises life without ever calling itself governance? This is not to suggest that governance is beyond scrutiny, nor that power is immune to challenge. But if authority no longer insists upon its own legitimacy, if it no longer feels the need to answer for itself, then what does it mean to demand accountability? If governance does not expect to be questioned, then does the act of questioning still hold the same force? Perhaps we are not governed less than before. Perhaps governance is not weaker, not less capable of responding, but simply less inclined to. And if power no longer anticipates resistance, if it no longer imagines itself as something that must be defended, then is it still something that can be confronted at all? Or has governance moved beyond the need for dialogue, existing instead as something that shapes the world without ever insisting upon its own authority? There was a time when governance implied responsibility. To hold power was to bear the weight of its consequences, to answer for the decisions that shaped the lives of others. Authority was inseparable from accountability, not always willingly, not always effectively, but at least in principle. The idea that those who govern could be judged, could be challenged, could be made to recognise the impact of their rule was fundamental to the way power was understood. Even in its most rigid forms, governance still carried with it an implicit awareness that it must in some way answer for itself. But today, governance moves in ways that do not always acknowledge responsibility, not because those who govern refuse it, but because responsibility itself has become difficult to locate. Decisions are still made, but they do not always have identifiable authors. Policies take effect, but they do not always appear as deliberate choices. Power is exercised, but it is no longer clear whether it belongs to those who wield it or to the structures that guide it. An automated hiring system filters candidates before a human ever sees their application. A predictive policing model flags neighbourhoods for surveillance before an officer makes a decision. A recommendation algorithm reshapes public discourse before anyone chooses what to say. These are decisions, but they are not easily traced to a single act of governance. They emerge from processes too complex to attribute to any one institution, too decentralized to hold to account, too interwoven with the fabric of daily life to be questioned in conventional terms. Where does responsibility lie when governance no longer moves through singular decisions, but through systems that operate without conscious intent? Who is responsible when a medical algorithm denies treatment based on patterns no one programmed? When a financial model excludes entire populations based on data no one selected? When a digital infrastructure shapes political realities before a single vote is cast? These are consequences, but they do not belong to any one entity. They are forms of governance, but they do not claim to be. This is not to say that accountability is impossible, nor that power evades responsibility by design. But if governance no longer appears as something to be held to account, if it does not insist upon its own role in shaping the world, then where does the demand for responsibility take hold? If there is no figure to address, no office to petition, no single decision to challenge, then how does one insist that governance still carries the obligation to answer for what it does? Perhaps governance has not escaped responsibility so much as responsibility has ceased to function in the way we once understood it. And if accountability depends on the ability to locate the source of a decision, then what remains of the idea that power must answer for its actions when those actions no longer appear as acts at all? There was a time when governance was expected to conclude. A decision was made, a law enacted, a policy implemented, each marking a point of finality, an endpoint where the process of governing reached a resolution. Governance, however complex, still carried a sense of completion, a moment when authority had spoken, when the mechanisms of rule had done their work. Even where power was continuous, even where policies evolved and institutions adapted, there was still a framework within which governance could be understood as something that moved in discrete steps with identifiable beginnings and endings. But today, governance does not conclude. It does not reach finality, nor does it settle into outcomes that can be clearly recognized as decisions. Instead, it moves as an ongoing process, shifting without distinct moments of enactment, adjusting without the need for formal deliberation. The decisions that shape the world do not arrive with a declaration. They emerge gradually through modifications in infrastructure, through unseen refinements to processes that no longer require intervention to continue functioning. A change in policy does not come as a moment of reform, but as an update to the logic of a system already in motion. A shift in regulation does not feel like a debate won or lost, but like an adjustment that has always been anticipated. The structures that govern do not pause for approval, nor do they require recognition to persist. Governance no longer happens in events, but in continuities, in subtle recalibrations that do not ask to be noticed. This is not the disappearance of power, nor is it a retreat from governance as such. It is simply a different mode of authority, one that does not insist upon its presence, does not require acknowledgement, does not wait to be understood. And if governance no longer arrives as something to be contested, if it does not produce moments where it must be affirmed or resisted, then does it still function in a way that allows for opposition? If authority no longer requires public assent, if it no longer depends on institutions that expect to be held accountable, then does the very act of governance still exist in the way we once understood it? Perhaps governance has not changed in its function, but in its form. Perhaps it does not need to be seen, does not need to declare itself, does not even need to remind us that it is there. The process continues, the systems adjust, the structures persist. And if governance no longer presents itself as something that must be questioned, then what remains of the idea that those who are governed still have a role in shaping it? Or has governance reached a state where it does not conclude because it no longer needs to? Perhaps governance has not disappeared entirely, but its invisibility has created a void, one that demands to be filled with something tangible, something that feels like rule, even if it is detached from the actual mechanisms of decision-making. If governance no longer presents itself in visible, deliberate ways, then what remains is spectacle, a version of politics that reduces complexity to simple, forceful gestures, where the performance of decision-making becomes more significant than the decisions themselves. This is the landscape in which binary politics thrives. Policies are no longer presented as trade-offs, compromises, or long-term adjustments, but as absolute choices. Fund or scrap, protect or attack, build or dismantle. The language of governance, once steeped in process and deliberation, gives way to a rhetoric of certainty, where problems are either solved instantly or framed as existential threats. This simplicity is not incidental. It is necessary in a system where the underlying mechanisms of power are too complex to contest directly. The appeal of this binary politics is that it feels real. Grand gestures, sweeping declarations, and combative headlines offer something clear, something graspable in a world where much of governance unfolds without direct acknowledgement. To say that a problem is nuanced, that a decision involves trade-offs, that a policy unfolds gradually, is to admit that governance happens beyond the realm of immediate control. But to say that something is either right or wrong, saved or destroyed, secured or threatened, restores the impression that power is still something that can be exercised in decisive, visible strokes. This is why extremism flourishes, not necessarily because all who embrace it seek radical change, but because it provides the clarity that traditional governance no longer seems to offer. It allows decisions to feel absolute, conflicts to feel personal, and leadership to feel strong, even when the deeper structures of power remain unchanged. It turns governance into something legible, an enemy to fight, a side to take, a crisis to resolve. And so, as the real work of governance moves further into the background, managed by automated systems, bureaucratic networks, and decision-making processes that do not require political spectacle, the theatre of politics becomes louder, more combative, more urgent. Simple choices are framed as moral imperatives. Compromises are rejected as weakness. Complexity itself becomes suspect, an admission that those in power are not truly in control. The gestures intensify, the rhetoric sharpens, the battle lines are drawn, because without this, governance would cease to feel like something that can still be seen at all.
This episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast was written, produced and researched by Benjamin James. It was read by Holly, a digital narrator. For further reading, resources and a chance to support the show, visit the episode webpage, where you'll find book recommendations, key topics to explore, and a way to buy me a coffee. And if you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on your preferred platform